To break down the details of that report is RNB Africa analyst Neville Mandimika. Neville, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. How well does infrastructure investments do in Africa, for starters?
Well, it's a growing asset class across the African continent. As you'd have read in our report, the African Development Bank recently came out and said, Africa needs approximately $130 billion annually to try and close the infrastructure gap that exists on the continent. And that number is actually up from a previous estimate of $90 billion. So there's quite a huge amount of money that is needed on the continent. And we're starting to see a combination of both public and private funds that are looking to actually invest in this growing and potentially lucrative asset class.
I mean, to underscore that, traditionally we've seen ICT infrastructure doing pretty well on the continent, but yet ICT hasn't really eclipsed road and electricity infrastructure, if you like. I mean, that hasn't been the case, has it?
No, it certainly hasn't been so. I mean, it's always nice to talk about the ICT investments that are going through in South Africa and Kenya, for example. But the quality of road networks, for example, and energy are still a very important consideration that needs to be financed. As you know, in some parts of Africa, electricity or quality electricity is quite a huge issue across the continent.
Neville, we always talk about weak legal, regulatory and institutional frameworks being very much a character of investments and barriers when it comes to Africa. I mean, to what extent are they country-specific, or is this blanket labeling really the true reflection of barriers to investment?
Yeah, I mean, if we look across the continent, I mean, countries that are making notable strides in terms of developing their PPP framework, for example, the likes of South Africa and Kenya tends to lead the charge in terms of de-risking this particular asset class in terms of investments, because that's what it's about, creating predictability, at least from a policy perspective, to allow for investors to be able to plan for 20, 30 years in horizon, as some of these projects may be.
For many years, you had war-torn countries in Africa, and some of them very rich by nature. You look at the DRC, for example, tons of natural wealth over there, but just political instability and war circumstances have just turned investors away. But it's quite interesting to see that South Africa's political instability, or not instability, but uncertainty, is beginning to sort of rise now compared to 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the perception now, that, from a policy perspective, there's a lot more predictability now. I think, the buzzword a few months ago was Ramaphoria, and we're seeing that in terms of investor perception. And I think that is really underscoring the performance of South Africa. Still sitting at number 2 in terms of our overall rankings to Egypt, but that gap between Egypt and South Africa is narrowing quite nicely, and part of that is the upliftment in terms of the political environment. Growth, unfortunately, is still lagging behind, but we're seeing some improvements from the political sphere.
Right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks very much indeed, Neville Mandimika, RNB Africa analyst. They're talking to us about African investment.